changing topics a little bit again. And I had mentioned, I think it was probably last week, that the last quarter or so of the semester, we're kind of shifting towards more applied aspects of social psychology. And that's going to continue. For the next 3 lectures, we're going to talk about stereotyping and prejudice, aggression, and helping. When social psychology was first becoming a field in the early 1900s or so, one of its motivating forces, one of its driving forces for the field in general, was that the researchers at the time wanted social psychology to be an applied science. They wanted people to be able to use the findings of social psychology to help improve the world in various aspects. And that is certainly true for all of the topics that we're going to be discussing from now until the end of the semester. So obviously, if one of the applied goals is to reduce prejudice or to reduce the likelihood that people stereotype, for instance, we have to have an understanding, a social psychological understanding of why it is that people stereotype in the first place, why it is that people are prejudiced in the first place. And so we're going to be discussing that today with the sort of ultimate goal of understanding these processes so that we can try to help reduce them in the real world. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to be talking about stereotyping and prejudice today. Mostly stereotyping, actually. If you recall, when we talked about the self and when we talked about attitudes, we talked about this ABC structure, right? Where we talk about the affective component, the behavioral component, and the cognitive component of these things. And we could do the same thing for this lecture as well. We can talk about the affective component, and what I mean by that in relation to prejudice is that prejudice refers to the negative feelings that people have towards other people from other groups. So that negative feeling aspect, that's the affective component, how we feel about something, in this case, how we feel about other groups. So when we talk about prejudice, which will mostly be probably on Tuesday, that's the affective component. We can talk about the behavioral component. In that case, that would be something like discrimination. So when people behave differently towards people of different races or different groups. So if someone only hires white men as opposed to black men, as opposed to white women, as opposed to Asian or Indian or any other race, that would be an example of discrimination because people are behaving differently depending on the group of people they're interacting with. But what we're going to be focusing on today is the cognitive component, and that refers to stereotyping. So when we talk about stereotyping, what we're talking about are beliefs that we have towards other people. Okay, so we're not talking about negative feelings we have towards other people, that's prejudice. And we're not necessarily talking about behaviors and the way we treat people differently, that's going to be more discrimination, although those things are going to come into play when we talk about stereotyping. But what we're mostly focusing on are the beliefs that people have that associate different groups of people with certain traits. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you have a good idea of what stereotypes are, but let's just go over some examples. So in the chat, write in some stereotypes that people have about athletes. So regardless of whether you believe they're true or not, what are some stereotypes that people have about athletes? Dumb, cocky, okay. Healthy, okay. Ooh, that's harsh, wife beaters, ooh. Outgoing, peaked in high school, okay. Okay, a lot of negative stereotypes, some positive ones like healthy as well, but we can use that to understand that stereotypes can be both negative or positive. What about car salesman? Pushy, liars, persistence. Okay, mostly negative ones probably for car salesmen. What about Canadians? Careful, I am a Canadian. Okay, bacon is not a trait. Hockey is not a trait either. Maple syrup is not a trait. Okay, we're just thinking about trait. Liking maple syrup could be a stereotype. Apologetic, friendly. Okay. Okay, mostly positive traits, I think, for Canadians for the most part. What about you guys, college students? Broke, 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 lots of broke. You guys really have no money at all, do you? Okay. Depressed, intelligent, hardworking. I mean, I'm sure you guys were thinking about all those things as well, right? You just didn't type them out. Okay. Fireman. Yeah, the number one answer I get usually on this one is hot. Okay, so some pretty good, pretty positive stereotypes for firemen, right? Brave, fit, heroes. Okay, that all works. Professors. Okay, yeah, I don't think hot applies to professors as much as it does to firemen, right? I don't think that's going to be the case. Likes to get lots of homework. Okay, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it does apply to some people. Then. Compassion. Okay, something like this, maybe, possibly, sometimes. In fact, these stereotypes that we have are often that they're very culturally shared, right? And to the extent that TV shows and movies will often capitalize on our tendency to stereotype certain people. And in fact, if you think of the show, and I'm taking kind of an old show here, Saved by the Bell, this whole entire show is completely based around stereotypes, basically. If you think about each character, you can classify them according to certain stereotypes. I'll give you some examples. So we've got the preppy main character. We've got the cheerleader, the jock, the nerd, feminist, spoiled, right? Every character is based on stereotypes that people tend to hold within this culture. And that works because they're quite reliable a lot of the time, at least within a culture. In 2006, a survey went out and it asked people a number of questions, but a couple of the questions it asked were the following. Who provides the greatest threat to your vision of American society? And then it gave people a bunch of different subgroups of people in the US. Another question was, who would you be least willing to allow your daughter to marry? And again, it gave a bunch of options of people. The number one answer to both those questions was the same, which was also the same as the number one answer to a question from a 2011 survey, in which 67, about 2/3 of people said that they would be uncomfortable with this type of person as president. And so my question to you, obviously there's a lot of negative stereotypes about this group of people. My question to you, who do you think this group of people is? Criminals, not criminals. Not black, not Arab people, not Muslims, not poor people, not women, definitely not white, no, not gay, not young, not Latin. No one's gotten it yet. There we go, someone did get it. All right, the number one answer to all these questions was atheists, it turns out. A very heavily discriminated against, or at least stereotyped group of people in the US. What are some stereotypes that people in the US have about atheists? Don't want kids, apathetic, evil, immoral, heartless, devil worshippers, violent. Okay, no emotion. Okay, so lots of negative stereotypes about atheists clearly within this culture. I've heard like baby eaters, things like that. Right? As an atheist myself, I can tell you I have not eaten a baby in months. But definitely one of the most stereotyped groups, I think, in this country. Okay, so as we can see, there are certainly a lot of negative stereotypes that exist. A lot. You could argue that the majority of stereotypes tend to be negative, but they're not always negative, right? We saw that with firemen, for instance. Is that there are a lot of positive stereotypes that we might hold about people as well, whether it's they're brave or they're hot or they're whatever, right? So the problem with stereotypes isn't that they're necessarily negative because they can be positive. Secondly, it's not always the case that stereotypes are necessarily inaccurate. Now, a lot of the time they are. They're certainly inaccurate a lot of the time. But they can be accurate. I mean, it might be the case that firefighters tend to be somewhat braver than non-firefighters. It's not always going to be the case. There's going to be exceptions to that rule, okay? But maybe it is the case. I don't know. I'm not aware of data that speak to it either way, but it's possible. It could be accurate. So the problem with stereotypes is not that they're necessarily inaccurate, because they can be accurate. The problem with stereotypes is that they tend to overgeneralize. It might be true that on average, firefighters are braver than people on average, but it's not always going to be true. It's certainly not true that every firefighter is braver than every non-firefighter, right? And similarly, any other stereotype we have about a group of people, even if it's accurate on a group level, will certainly not be accurate for every individual that's a part of that group. And so the problem with stereotypes is that they lead us to overgeneralize, to form impressions of people before we even get to know who they are. And that's going to be a problem, as we're going to see. There's a couple of reasons why we tend to form stereotypes. One of them is due to what's known as social categorization. And that simply means that we like to sort people into groups. It makes the world easier to think about. Remember that as a general rule, something we've talked about before in this class, as a general rule, people don't like to think very much. There's always exceptions to this. Right? People with a high need for cognition, for instance, tend to like to think. But as a general rule, we tend not to like to think very much. And if we could simplify how we think about the world, then all the better. We tend to like that. And categorizing people into groups allows us to simplify the world. Right? If we can classify the world into men and women and people of different races, gay and straight and bi and trans, etc., if we can do that, it makes the world easy to think about. And if we can apply labels to each of those individual groups, that makes the world even easier to think about. So you could argue that one of the main reasons that people tend to stereotype is because it simplifies the world. People are messy, right? People are complex. People have a constellation of personality traits. But if we can reduce that to describing a group of people using a single trait or a small handful of traits, that makes the world really simple to think about. And we tend to like that. So we tend to we have this sort of almost intrinsic desire to want to categorize people for that reason. The problem, though, is that when we start dividing the world into various groups, then invariably, of course, we fall into certain groups and not into other groups. So if you divide the world into groups based on nationality, then most of you, I assume, are American, right? And when you're a part of a group, we call that group an in-group, okay? In-groups are the groups that you belong to. So Americans would be the in-group for many of you, right? FIU students would be an in-group for everybody. But of course, you've got out-groups as well. So any group that you do not belong to would count as an out-group. And so we can divide the world into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different groups, right? And so you've got hundreds and hundreds of different in-groups based on your race, your sex, your profession, your age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, or even something as simple as if you're a fan of a certain sports team, then other fans of that team are part of your in-group, and fans of other teams you're not a fan of, those would be your out-groups. Remember that we saw earlier in this semester that we have a tendency on an individual level to want to think really highly of ourselves, right? That was a general theme that we saw at the beginning of the semester. We like to think highly of ourselves because we really like to have self-esteem. We like to think that about ourselves. And so as a consequence, we often distort information to make ourselves feel better. And the same idea applies to the in-groups that we're a part of, which leads to what's called the in-group bias. In-group bias refers to a tendency that people have to favor people in their own in-groups. Because after all, if my in-group, if I can convince myself my in-group is the best group to be in, I get to derive some sense of self-esteem from that. I get to feel good about myself, about the fact that I'm part of that in-group. And so we tend to favor people who are also in our in-groups. If you meet other people who are from the same city as you, or state or country, or who are fans of the same team as you, or whatever, we have a tendency to sort of immediately connect with those people, right? Because we tend to like them automatically just by virtue of the fact that they're part of the same group that we're a part of. This idea that we have this bias for in-group members is going to become really important next week when we look at prejudice and we look at some of the theories for why prejudice exists. We're going to see that one of those theories is based pretty heavily on this idea. So we're going to come back to that idea later on. Okay. But for now, know that the in-group bias is a bias that we exhibit as far as the groups that we tend to prefer. Another bias that people tend to exhibit as it relates to stereotypes is what's called the outgroup homogeneity effect. This refers to a tendency that we have to assume that everybody in a specific outgroup tends to be much more similar to each other than people within our in-groups. In other words, if you think about, let's just say, other FIU students, and you think about all the variability there are between different FIU students, and you can recognize that there's a lot of differences between different FIU students. But if you were to think about, let's say, Harvard students, people's natural tendency is to think, well, those people, they're kind of all the same, right? All Harvard students are kind of the same. FIU students are different, of course, but Harvard students are all the same. But if you ask someone from Harvard, they would say the exact opposite. They would tend to think that Harvard students are all different, and it's FIU students who are all the same. And that's the outgroup homogeneity effect, this tendency to assume that people in other groups are all the same compared to people in our own in-groups. There's lots of sayings that people have that sort of underlie this idea. So if you ever heard Asians or Blacks or Jews or Hispanics or whites or whoever, some group of people, they're all alike, right? That is basically indicating the outgroup homogeneity effect. Because whenever people say a sentence like this, it's never a group that they belong to. I would never say something like, all those white people are all the same, right? But you hear lots of white people say, all those Asians are all the same, or whatever. Right? And that tendency is the outgroup homogeneity effect. I did grad school in Iowa. Iowa's like 96% white or something ridiculous like that. But when I was in grad school, there's another grad student who had come from South Korea. And after 2 weeks of living in Iowa, which is like 96% white, she pulled a friend of mine aside and said, I don't know how you do it. And he said, how we do what? She said, I don't know how you white people tell each other apart. You all look the same to me, right? Now, we don't usually think of it that way because we tend to think in terms of our own groups, and it's the outgroups that all seem similar to us. But she's displaying the same effect that we tend to display for outgroup people as well, this outgroup homogeneity effect. In fact, if we think about this, I think that outgroup homogeneity, that sort of effect, has infiltrated the way that people write TV and movies. And I'll give you an example. Okay, if you think about TV shows or movies that have aliens in them, so I'll take Star Trek, but it applies to any sort of movie that you've seen with aliens in them. Almost invariably, if you look at the humans in that movie, there's all sorts of diversity, right? So if you look at Star Trek, there's all sorts of diversity. You've got Black, white, Asian, different races. You got different sexes. You got different hairstyles. Everyone's a little bit different from each other. But the aliens in these movies almost always look identical to each other, right? You never see an alien movie where there's different alien, or very rarely, where there's different alien cultures, where the aliens look different from one another. Now, why is that the case? Well, part of the reason, I think, is because the writers of these TV shows and movies fall prey to the outgroup homogeneity effect, where they can easily recognize the differences between humans, but we always have a tendency to think those others, in this case, aliens, are all similar to one another. So I think that's a demonstration of the outgroup homogeneity effect for the most part. So why does it exist? Why do we exhibit the outgroup homogeneity effect? Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. First off, we tend to have greater contact with people in our own in-groups. So in other words, you have a lot of contact with other FIU students. You probably don't have a lot of contact with Harvard students. As a consequence, you get to learn about the differences between FIU students because you come in contact with them more. You never learn how Harvard students might differ from one another because you don't have enough contact with them. So it's easy to see differences with people in our in-groups, or easier than it is to see differences between people in our out-groups. And furthermore, when we do have contact with people in our out-groups, it tends to be on a much more superficial level where we don't get to see that sort of variability. So for instance, if it were ever the case, for whatever reason, that Harvard, their football team came down here and played against the FIU football team, okay? You might come in contact with some Harvard fans if they came down as well, but it'd be in a very limited context, right? It'd only be in the context of watching that football game. And within that context, all those Harvard people are kind of behaving similarly. They're always cheering whenever Harvard scores, right? And they're all behaving sort of the same way. And so that can easily lead you to form this impression that all those Harvard people are the same because you're only seeing them within this very limited context. Because you have more intimate contact with people in our own in-groups, again, you can learn about the differences between people in our in-groups even more. The stereotypes that we have about other people can distort the way that we interpret or remember information. And I want to give you a couple examples of how that can be the case. And this comes back to the idea of why stereotypes can be problematic, because they can distort the way that we interpret information. So for instance, if you think about the scenario where a Boy Scout grabs the arm of an elderly woman and you form an image of that in your head. And then you also form an image of this, a skinhead grabs the arm of an elderly woman. Chances are you have two very different images in your head of what's actually happening here, right? In the first case, you might have an image where a Boy Scout is trying to help an elderly woman cross the road. And in the second case, you might have an image where a skinhead is grabbing her arm to steal her purse. Now, there is nothing within those sentences that leads you or that objectively states that the Boy Scout is being helpful and the skinhead is being aggressive. But because of the stereotypes that you have about Boy Scouts and skinheads, you have filled in those gaps in knowledge with your own stereotypes. And you interpret the same sentence consistently with those stereotypes that you already have. In the same way, a mother yelled at a 14-year-old girl and a construction worker yelled at a 14-year-old girl might conjure up different images of what's actually happening in your head, not because there's anything in the sentence that leads you to form those impressions, but because we have stereotypes about mothers and about construction workers that change the way that we interpret information. And that can be a problem, because what that means is that if we have negative stereotypes about a certain group of people, and those stereotypes are false, they can color and change the way that we interpret those people's behavior. So for instance, this was a study done multiple decades ago. I think it's something like the 60s or something. And what participants in this case were all white college students. Okay? And what these college students did is they watched a video of two kids who were playing sort of aggressively, but kind of roughhousing, right? It's a little ambiguous whether they're being aggressive or just playful. It's kind of somewhere in between, sort of this ambiguously aggressive behavior. The key is that one of these boys is white and one of the boys is black. Now, especially at the time, these white college students tended to have stereotypes that black people are aggressive. And so despite the fact that both of these boys were engaged in the exact same behaviors, when these students were later asked to rate how aggressive these two boys were, they tended to say that the black boy was behaving more aggressively than the white boy. Not because he actually was, because he wasn't, but because their stereotypes that black people are aggressive tended to distort the way that they interpreted that video. They tended to see more aggressive behavior on the part of the black person than the white person. So these negative stereotypes that people had led them to judge people more harshly. In fact, we see similar sorts of things when you look at the criminal justice system, where black people often face harsher penalties than white people for the same crimes. And part of the reason for that is that the people, maybe the judges or the jurors or whoever, because of their stereotypes they might have about black people, perceive their behavior as worse than it objectively is, and therefore they tend to get longer sentences. Obviously, that's a problem. But moreover, there's other problems with these stereotypes as well. They can distort our perceptions in other ways, because we tend to notice and remember stereotype consistent information better than stereotype inconsistent information. In other words, when something happens that's consistent with my stereotypes, I notice that, I remember that. If something happens that's inconsistent with my stereotypes, I tend to sort of dismiss it. I don't remember it later on. So for instance, actually, I'm going to save that example for a little bit later. Okay. But the point is that if you have someone who has negative stereotypes about people, so let's say that someone has negative stereotypes about illegal immigrants, and they think that illegal immigrants commit a whole lot of violent crimes. Now, it turns out that in reality, illegal immigrants do not commit crimes at a greater rate than other people. In fact, I think they commit crimes at a lower rate, which makes sense because if you're an illegal immigrant, you don't want to be caught up in the law because you might leave the country, right? But if people believe that illegal immigrants commit more crimes than non-immigrants, then they're going to remember every time they see a news story where an illegal immigrant committed a crime, they tend to remember that because it's consistent with their stereotypes. And they don't remember all the times when illegal immigrants didn't behave aggressively or didn't behave violently or didn't break the law, right? As a consequence, these people think that illegal immigrants commit crimes at a greater rate than non-immigrants because that's what they remember. But what they're remembering is biased by the various stereotypes that they have. This is a picture from a famous study back in the 40s. You might have come across this in other psychology classes. It's pretty famous. But basically, what participants had to do is look at this picture, and you can see it looks like there's basically two men arguing in the forefront of the picture. A white man and a black man. Looks like they're on a subway or a bus or something like that. Now, the key here is that there seems to be some sort of aggressive behavior. This guy seems to be kind of angry, and in his left hand, there's a switchblade, okay, or a blade of some sort. So what participants did is they would look at this picture for a minute, try to remember it, then the picture would disappear. And what that person would have to do is tell another participant who had not seen this image what the image was all about. And then that person had to tell a third person who had never seen this image what the image was about. That person had to tell a fourth person. So if you've ever played the game of telephone, where you say something to one person and they say it to the next person, they say it to the next person. Part of why people play, or I guess really the main point of why people play that game of telephone, is that usually that information somewhere along the line gets distorted and the last person is hearing a totally different statement than the first person made. And that's effectively what the researchers were doing with this study. They wanted to see whether the participants who were describing this image, whether that image would become distorted at some point down the line. And so after they've transmitted it to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, the researchers would ask the final person to tell them what the image was. And in more than half of the cases, the final person reported an image in which the black man had the blade, not the white man. At some point along that chain, that blade switched from the white man's hand to the black man's hand. Okay, now, how would that have occurred? Well, keep in mind, again, this is done in the 40s. There's a lot of discrimination, a lot of prejudice, especially against black people, and a lot of stereotypes that black people are aggressive. So let's say that the first participant is looking at this image, and when they describe it to the next person, they say, well, there's a scene where there's a bus, there's a bunch of people on the bus, there's two men who are having an argument, there's a white man, there's a black man, the white man has a switchblade. That more or less describes what's going on here. Then that second person describes it to a third person, and now they say, so there's a bunch of people on a bus, there's a white man and a black man, they're arguing, and there's a switchblade involved. And then that person describes it to the next person, and they say, well, there's a bunch of people on a bus, a white man and a black man are arguing, and a black man has a switchblade. And it's not even necessarily that people are lying, but what happens is that at some point while telling this or describing this image, at some point some miscommunication occurs and people assume that it's the black man that has the blade, not the white man, because that's what's consistent with their stereotypes. So there's a number of ways in which the stereotypes that we have can distort the way that we remember information or interpret information. But what I want to, I guess the question I want to ask now is, if it's the case that a lot of the stereotypes that we have are inaccurate, and as I said, there are some accurate stereotypes, but a lot of the stereotypes we have are inaccurate, how is it the case that those stereotypes survive? I have heard it said by many people, things like, it wouldn't be a stereotype if there wasn't some element of truth to it. And I can understand why people say that. The problem is it's completely false. There are many stereotypes that exist without having any truth to them whatsoever. That is very possible. So the question is, how is that the case? I mean, don't you think that if you had stereotypes about a certain group of people, you get enough feedback from the real world to learn eventually that your stereotypes are wrong, and therefore you can get rid of them, right? Well, we're going to look at 4 different mechanisms through which stereotypes can survive. even if they're completely inaccurate. The first way is through processes of illusory correlations. So in fact, in this section, we're going to come back to a lot of the things we looked at in the social cognition section. And so if you recall from that section, we talked about illusory correlations, which occurs when people believe that two things are related that in fact are not related at all. And so here's the idea. In general, minorities tend to be distinctive, meaning we tend to notice them more, which sort of makes sense. If you're in a room of people, if someone walks in that room, and let's say you're in a group of like 20 people, if someone walks in that room who's 7 feet 6 inches tall, you're going to notice that person, right? Because they're distinctive. They're in a minority of really, really tall people. They tend to stand out. And so you notice that person. If someone walks in the room who's 5'9", you're probably not going to notice them because that's pretty much an average height, right? So just by being part of a minority, those people tend to be more distinctive to others. We tend to notice them more. Furthermore, we also tend to find bad behavior more distinctive. We sort of expect when we encounter people that they're going to be at least mildly pleasant, right? That they're not going to be just immediately rude to you. So because of that, when people behave in a way that we expect they behave pleasantly, it's not that distinctive. But if someone behaves really rudely to you, if you have a rude encounter with a cashier at a grocery store, you remember that for a while, right? That stands out to you because bad behavior tends to be distinctive. So the problem is that because minorities are distinctive, and because bad behavior is distinctive, and because we tend to remember distinctive events, then when you're thinking back at the interactions you've had with people in the majority and people in the minority, what tends to stand out to people, what they tend to remember, are those instances where minorities engaged in bad behavior. People are less likely to remember instances where minorities engaged in good behavior or where people in the majority engaged in bad behavior. And I'll give you an example. Let's take homosexuality and child abuse. And I've heard people say that homosexuals are more likely to commit child abuse than heterosexuals. And I've never seen any evidence for that whatsoever. So why is it that people would have that stereotype? Right? Well, we can sort of break this into this 2x2 table, right? So let's imagine now, obviously we can't cleanly divide the world into hetero and homosexuals. There's other categories as well, but for the purposes of this, that's what we're gonna do. And let's say that people commit child abuse or they don't commit child abuse. Well, because homosexuals are in the minority in terms of just the number of people, we tend to find it more distinctive when we come in contact with someone who's homosexual versus heterosexual. And furthermore, because child abuse is obviously a negative behavior and negative behaviors are distinctive, we tend to remember if we hear about a person committing child abuse. And so what that means is what we tend to remember the most are instances where people in the minority, in this case, homosexuals, commit child abuse. That's what we tend to remember the most. And we don't tend to remember those instances as well when heterosexuals commit child abuse or when homosexuals don't commit child abuse. And as a consequence, even if there is absolutely no relationship whatsoever between sexual preference, sexual orientation, and committing child abuse, people tend to over-remember those instances where homosexuals committed child abuse, which leads them to believe, in many cases, that that relationship actually exists. In other words, it leads them to develop this illusory correlation between those two variables, even when there isn't one. Okay? So that's one example whereby stereotypes can exist despite a complete lack of evidence for them. A second way that stereotypes can survive is through an attributional process. So when we looked at attributions, we saw that we have a tendency to attribute other people's behavior either to their personality or the situation, usually to their personality, right? We usually make internal dispositional attributions about other people's behavior. I'm going to give you one exception to that, though, because it is certainly true that when we see someone engaged in a behavior that's consistent with their stereotypes about that person, we tend to attribute it to their personality. However, when we see someone engaged in a behavior that's inconsistent with their stereotypes, we tend not to attribute it to their personality. This is an exception to the fundamental attribution error. Remember earlier, we saw that the fundamental attribution error refers to a tendency that most people have to attribute other people's behavior to their personality. Right? The one exception to that is when that other person is engaged in behavior that contradicts our stereotypes. Then we tend to attribute it to the situation because that allows us to maintain our stereotypes. So let's say, for instance, that I have a stereotype, which I don't have, but let's say I have the stereotype that Hispanic students, they're just no good at social psychology. That's the stereotype, let's say, that I have. Well, if I see a Hispanic student in my class fail an exam, then I say, you know what, that's because they're just bad at social psychology. See, that confirms my stereotype. Right? I attribute it to their personality. It's a dispositional attribution. On the other hand, if I see a Hispanic student get the best score in my class, well, that's inconsistent with my stereotypes. So what I immediately start doing is looking for a way to excuse that behavior, to write it off somehow. And one way to do that is by attributing their behavior to the situation. It must be that they cheated. It must be that my exams were just too easy. I need to make them harder. I made it too easy for the Hispanic students. I attribute their performance to something other than their personality. And that way, I never have to look at my own stereotypes, right? I can keep maintaining my stereotypes even in the face of contradictory evidence, because I can always attribute that behavior to something else, to some aspect of the situation. Okay, so we see another example of how the attributions that we make for other people's behavior can become biased. In this case, they're biased by our stereotypes. A third way that stereotypes can survive is through a process known as subtyping. Subtyping occurs when we acknowledge that there's some group of people that are not matching up to our stereotypes, but we consider them to be an exception, that those people don't represent the larger group of people. So for instance, let's say that I have a stereotype that women aren't any good at sports. Okay? Women are not athletic. That's my stereotype. And then I come across things like a women's hockey team or whatever. Now, if I was behaving rationally, I would use that information and maybe revise my stereotypes. I can get rid of my stereotype, for instance, right? But what people often do is they engage in subtyping. So they say, well, okay, I can acknowledge that there is this women's hockey team, but those aren't like women. Those are like an exception, right? Those are different from real women. And so what I'm doing is I'm sort of cordoning them off into this one special category. There's like regular women, then there's these exception to women, right? But they don't represent regular women. And that way I can acknowledge the existence of female athletes while still maintaining my belief that women in general aren't athletic because these athletes don't represent women at large. There's a scene in the Spike Lee movie, Do the Right Thing. This came out in, I think it was like 1989 or 1990, somewhere in there. It's an older movie, but it's a really good movie if you want to check it out. In that movie, Spike Lee plays a character. He's a black character, a black man, who is working at a pizza shop. And one of the other people he works there is played by an actor by the name of John Turturro. And his character is Italian and is quite racist against black people. And one day, Spike Lee pulls him aside and says, look, I don't understand how you're racist. I mean, who is your favorite basketball player? And John Turturro's character says, Magic Johnson, who's a black man. And Spike Lee says, who's your favorite singer? And he says, Prince. And he says, who's your favorite comedian? And he says, Eddie Murphy. And Spike Lee says, look, I don't understand this. How are you racist when your favorite actor, your favorite comedian, your favorite basketball player, they're all black? How can you be racist against black people? And John Turturro says, okay, I understand. Okay, I understand your confusion. Let me explain it to you. Okay, they're black, but they're not like black. I mean, they're black, but not really black. They don't represent black people. They're not black in that way, right? Now, what he's basically doing is he's engaging in subtyping at that point. He's acknowledging, he's saying, yeah, they're black people, and I like those black people, but they don't represent black people at large. They're special, they're exceptions, right? That's exactly what subtyping is. A fourth way that stereotypes tend to survive is through various processes that involve confirmation biases and self-fulfilling prophecies. And I see that people already mentioned this in the chat, so let's explain this a little bit. Now, we know that due to confirmation biases, we tend to only look for information that supports what we already believe. We saw that before in social cognition, right? And so what that means is that if I have a stereotype, I tend to only look for information that supports that stereotype. So if I have the stereotype, I'll use an example I used before, that illegal immigrants tend to commit violent crimes. I tend to look for information that supports that belief. So maybe I look at news sources that tend to show that instances in which illegal immigrants committed violent crimes. I don't look for information that is counter to my stereotypes. And so I never come across the information that I might need to get rid of my stereotypes. Okay, so that's just a standard confirmation bias type of effect. But these false stereotypes that we have can also be self-fulfilling. They can result in these self-fulfilling prophecies. Remember, a self-fulfilling prophecy is when I have a belief that's not true. Because of that belief, I start acting towards people in a manner consistent with that belief, which gets them to respond in a manner that confirms my false belief. So I'll give you an example as it relates to stereotyping. This is a study whereby white students were told they were going to be interviewing someone for a position, for like a job. And the person they were interviewing was either white or black. Now, what the researchers wanted to know is two things. The first thing they wanted to know is, would these white interviewers treat the interviewee differently based on their race? And so they recorded certain behaviors that the interviewer would engage in. And what they showed is that these white interviewers, when they were interviewing a white person, they would look them in the eye, they would speak slowly, and they would ask them a bunch of follow-up questions. They would be interested in their responses, etc. But when those people were interviewing a black person, what they tended to do is they wouldn't look them in the eye, and they'd speak really quickly, and they wouldn't really ask them questions, and then maybe they'd lean back in their chair, and they wouldn't be interested in their responses. Okay? So the first thing the authors or the researchers are showing is that these white interviewers are treating black and white people differently based on the stereotypes that they had, in this case, it was that the white applicant would be better than the black applicant. Okay? So they treated them differently. The second thing the researchers wanted to know, though, and maybe more importantly, was, would these people being interviewed, would they respond differently based on how they were treated? And what they showed is that the white applicants, they did pretty well. If you just recorded their behavior and you showed it to other people, they would agree that they did pretty well in these interviews. But if you took the black applicants and you looked at their behavior and you showed that to people and had them rate how good a job the black applicant did, they tended to be rated worse. They were performing worse. Now, why is that the case? Well, it's not the case that the black applicants were worse than the white applicants, because there's a number of metrics to show they were not worse. They were equal. Okay? But what happened is that the black applicants were treated differently by the interviewers. If you're being interviewed and the person who's interviewing isn't looking you in the eye and is leaning back and isn't showing any interest in you, that you're not going to perform so well, right? Maybe you get a little nervous. You realize they're not interested in you, and you start stammering and stuttering over your words, and you just don't behave, or you don't react as well. So what was happening here was a self-fulfilling prophecy, because these interviewers who had a false belief, i.e. that the white applicant is better than the black applicant, because of that false belief, they treated the white applicant better than the black applicant, even though they may not have realized they were doing it. They treated the white applicant better than the black applicant. And because they were treated better, the white applicant actually did better at the interview than the black applicant. Not because they were objectively better, but because they were treated differently. And so if I'm an interviewer and I have these expectations and I don't treat the black applicants as well, and as a consequence, the black applicants don't do as well at the interview, I notice this and I say, see, that confirms my belief. See, the white applicants are inherently better than the black applicants. Now, what's happened here is I don't realize that the only reason the black applicant didn't do as well is because I treated them poorly. I'm not aware that that's the case. To me, it feels as if my stereotype is being confirmed, right? That results in a self-fulfilling prophecy, in other words. Okay, one other bias I want to talk about as it relates to stereotypes, which is kind of related to what we talked about, although it's a little bit different, is something known as stereotype threat. This will require a little bit more of an explanation, because this one's not quite as intuitive, maybe, as some of the other ones. But stereotype threat occurs or is a result of a self-confirming apprehension, meaning a person who is aware that there is a negative stereotype against them is concerned that they're going to be evaluated based on that negative stereotype. So let's take an example. Let's take the stereotype that exists among some people in this culture, that Black people aren't as good verbally as white people. Okay. Now, here's what some researchers did. Knowing that the stereotype exists, they wanted to know whether Black people who were taking a verbal test, who were aware that that stereotype exists, they believe that those people might be concerned that the evaluator, the person who's grading them on this verbal test, they might have that negative stereotype about themselves. As a consequence, that might make the test taker really nervous, right? Like, I don't want to be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. I don't want this guy to think that I'm only performing poorly because I'm Black. Okay? And the problem is that that concern that they're going to be evaluated based on a negative stereotype interferes with their ability to concentrate on the test. And as a consequence, they do worse on that test. Not because they're inherently worse, but because they were so preoccupied with being potentially evaluated negatively based on that stereotype that they weren't able to concentrate on the test itself. That's what stereotype threat is. So what they did is they conducted a study, these researchers, to look at this. And they had white and Black people take a verbal test. But for half of the participants, they were told the test is not diagnostic of their abilities. Meaning, you know what, we've just thrown together this test. It doesn't actually predict your verbal abilities. It has nothing to do with your actual verbal abilities. It's just a test we put together. So it's not diagnostic of anything. The other half of the participants were told that the test is diagnostic. They were told this test has been around for decades. We know that it correlates really strongly with people's actual verbal aptitude. So whatever score you get in this test, it's a pure reflection of your actual verbal ability. Other than that, though, the tests that they actually performed were completely identical. So what we're looking at are the participants' scores on this test. Now, when these participants were told that the test is not diagnostic of their abilities, it doesn't actually relate to their verbal abilities, the white and the Black students perform equally well. There's no actual racial difference in terms of this test. However, when these participants were told that the test is diagnostic of their verbal abilities, suddenly the white students outperform the Black students. Now, why is that the case? Well, we know it's not the case because there's an actual difference between white and Black students, because there was no difference when they were told the test is not diagnostic of their abilities. Right? What happens is that when people are told the test relates to their actual verbal skills, it doesn't affect the white students, but it does seem to harm the Black students' performance. Why is that the case? Well, because in this condition, these Black students who are taking this test are thinking, there's a negative stereotype about Black people on verbal tests. I don't want to live up to that negative stereotype. I don't want this researcher to think I'm only performing poorly because I'm a Black person. And they're so concerned with how they're going to come across, how they're going to be evaluated based on the stereotype, that they can't concentrate on the verbal test, which leads them to actually perform worse. And this stereotype threat has been shown across a number of different groups of people on a number of different tests. I'll give you another example. There's a stereotype that women aren't as good at math than men. And so the researchers who are aware that the stereotype exists used it to look at stereotype threats for women on a math test. So what they did is something similar to the last study, a little bit different though. For half the participants, they were told that a gender difference is not expected. They're told that we've given this test to thousands of people, men and women do equally well. That's what half the people were told. And when they're told that, the men and the women perform equally well. That little tiny difference there is not a significant difference. Okay? They perform equally well on the math test. However, the other half of the participants were told that a gender difference was expected. That when we've given this test to thousands of people in the past, men tend to perform better than women. And when the men and women take this test, the exact same test as the other half of the participants, when they take this test, suddenly the men outperform the women. Okay, now what's happening here? Again, what's happening is that the women are told that they're likely not going to do as well as the men. And they start thinking, you know what, I don't want to be a stereotype. I don't want to be evaluated negatively just because I'm a woman taking a math test. And that concern that they have for being evaluated negatively disrupts their ability to concentrate on the math test, which leads them to do worse on the math test. And again, it's not because the women are inherently worse at math than men. We know that's not true because in this condition, when they're told there is no gender difference, women perform equally as well because they don't have to feel concerned about sort of performing bad on the math test due to their gender, right? So it's not because women are inherently worse than men at math. It's solely because they had an expectation of being evaluated negatively, which interfered with their ability to concentrate on the test itself. Okay, in other words, differences in performance between these groups that we see in these studies were not due to inherent biological differences between white people and black people or between men and women. They were due to differences in expectations. Okay, if you expect other people to evaluate you negatively based on a stereotype, that interferes with your ability to concentrate on that test. Now, this is true even if the evaluator, the person giving the test, doesn't actually have that negative stereotype. As long as the test taker believes that that person has the stereotype, that's enough to actually harm their performance. In fact, there are some studies that have shown that if all you do is ask people their gender or their race at the beginning of a test, just asking them that simple question can harm their performance on the test. And so one of the recommendations here is to avoid stereotype threat. Don't ask questions about people's gender or race, at least not at the beginning of the test. If you really need that information, collect it at the end of the test after they've already completed it. But just asking them at the beginning of the test can harm certain people's performance. Okay. And so you can see that stereotype threat is another way that these negative stereotypes can survive, right? If I, as a teacher, as a professor, if I think that the Hispanic students don't do as well in social psychology as the other students, and you're aware that I have that negative stereotype. Well, if you're a Hispanic student, you don't want to be evaluated based on that negative stereotype. And so every time you take a test, you're really concerned about that. So you don't do as well on the tests. And so at the end of the semester, I look at all the students' grades, and suddenly the Hispanic students don't perform as well as the other students. And that leads me to conclude that, see, I was right. My stereotype was right all along. And what I've failed to realize that the only reason the Hispanic students didn't perform as well as the other students is because they knew I had that negative stereotype, which harmed their performance. So I'm painting kind of a negative picture here, right? I've talked about some of the problems with having these negative stereotypes. I've talked about the ways in which these stereotypes exist, even if they're completely untrue. And so the question, I guess, is stereotyping inevitable? Is there anything that we can do about it? If all these psychological mechanisms exist for us to maintain even completely false stereotypes, what can we do about it? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to go into a little bit more of the psychology of stereotyping. And in particular, I want to talk about a very popular theory of stereotyping called the two-step process of stereotyping, which was proposed by a woman by the name of Patricia Devine back in 1989. Here's how stereotyping works according to this model. First off, when you perceive a member of a group, the idea is that that automatically triggers stereotypes about that group. And this is true among everybody, even if you don't believe in the stereotype, okay? Just coming across someone from a stereotype group should automatically activate that stereotype. Now, the important idea here is that this first process, this first step, is completely unconscious. You're not aware necessarily that this is even happening, okay? It's happening at a level below your consciousness. You're not trying to make it happen, it just automatically gets triggered. And that's the second aspect, is that it's out of our control. There's nothing we can do about it. The idea here is that you've grown up within a culture in which these stereotypes exist. And you're aware of those stereotypes. And your simple awareness of those stereotypes is enough to trigger them when you encounter someone from that group. So for instance, if you've grown up in this culture, then when you come across someone who's dressed like this, that might automatically trigger a stereotype of terrorist. Because within this culture, there is a stereotype that associates people from the Middle East with terrorism, at least among some portions of the country. And even if you don't believe that stereotype, which you shouldn't, But even if you don't believe that stereotype, you're aware that that stereotype exists. And so when you come in contact with someone who dresses this way, that might automatically activate ideas of terrorism. Again, not because you believe it, but simply because you're aware that the stereotype exists within this culture.